Well, what's going on, guys, and welcome to New Bark News Podcast for February 10th, 2019. As per usual, I'm joined by Logan, and let's go ahead and kick off today with some games that came out this week.
So, back at it again.
I know, right? We had a jack ton of releases this week, if we're counting the indie ones, so I'm just going to go over some ones that kind of stuck out based off the very little research time I put in before these episodes. So we got God Eater 3, which is supposedly like Monster Hunter 3 if you turned it into an anime. So that's a thing. Then we've got Away, Journey to the Unexpected, Blaze Blue Central Fiction Special Edition for the Switch, which is like a 1v1 fighter thingy. Etrian Odyssey Nexus, that one I'll definitely touch on in a sec. They made a game called Memes, and it's like a abbreviation, so it's M.E.M.E.S. I'm very curious.
Already excited.
Yeah, I know, right? I'm very curious about what that is. I have a feeling it's probably awful, but maybe ironically brilliant. Then we've got Project Winter, which is supposedly an 8-player survival game thingamajig. Settlement Zero just had a neat name, so I put it on the list. And then Yokai Watch 3 for the 3DS, which apparently that's like the new Pokemon thing, which is popular amongst the youths these days.
That thing's still kicking?
I know, right? That's what I'm wondering, dude. When I started seeing that on store shelves, I figured, oh, this is just like Bakugan. It's going to be around for like a year and then disappear. But apparently it's still a thing.
Well, then again, Bakugan did come back, didn't it?
Yeah, it recently made a comeback. It's more like card game focused now, I think. Like, you still have the Bakugan, but they're not... I don't know. A bunch of Yugi tubers I watched did some things reviewing it, but I didn't pay a ton of attention to it. But yeah, I mean, this seems like a decent list. You got Monster Hunter-ish thing. Etrian Odyssey Nexus is made by Atlas, so it's probably good. I picked that up, actually.
Memes?
Dude, memes? I'm actually highly curious what kind of game that even is. Like, I feel like it was probably a mobile game, just based on the title. But...
maybe we should do more research before these.
Yeah, we probably should. But that's for next week. That's future Andrew and future Logan's job to do that.
Very true.
But, dude, this is not a bad list. It's not as big as next week. Next week's like full of AAA titles, but I'm hyped for Etrian Odyssey. I picked that up. Jason's been recommending that to me for a long time, and we're going to actually be doing a first impressions video on the YouTube channel sometime later this week for that game, and it's going to be a good time. But yeah, anything notable stand out from that list to you?
No.
Brilliant. That's what I love to hear. All right, so then we'll go ahead and jump right into the news segment. I mean, this week wasn't as big, like, major releases as we're usually used to. I know God Eater 3 is a big deal for people who are playing those games, but still. Anyway, so starting off, in Pennsylvania, they're proposing a tax on M-rated games that they're apparently going to boost, like, the price of all M-rated games by 10% if this goes through. And the idea is... well, violent video games increase violence in schools, so any money made off of this tax is going to go into preventing school violence, and those types of things. So, just, to put that into perspective, that's been a long-going debate for a long time that a lot of people have tried to claim violent video games increase violence, and the evidence has been inconclusive at best every single time.
Yeah, this has been going on since the 90s, and while these lawmakers claim that this isn't about censorship, rather about finding a new stream of income, it does not look good for their optics.
No, not at all, and if it's not about censorship, why are you specifically targeting M-rated games? I mean, I guess my thing there especially is, if your issue is, like, the violence and such, I know plenty of M-rated games I've played where there is a T-rated game that's just as violent or more violent than the M-rated one.
Very true, there's just less blood.
Exactly, like Persona 4, for example, it's M-rated because a lot of the themes and some of the other stuff, but there's not that much blood going on in there. Like, I've honestly seen worse stuff in, like, PG-13 movies than some M-rated games.
Yeah, the ESRB... isn't rating these games strictly based off of violence.
Exactly, and I guess my weirdness with the ESRB as a whole, because I feel like this is a good way to segue into it, is I feel like for most gamers, there really aren't 5 ratings, or however many exist in other countries, because we are talking about the US rating system here, because, you know, there's E, E10 and up, T, M, and technically A, though I don't think in my entire existence I've ever seen like an A-rated game in a store. But still, I feel like for most gamers, there's everything that's not M-rated, and then there's M-rated games. Like, I remember growing up, I was always allowed to play T games, no matter what age I was. It was, once I got to a certain age, I was finally allowed to play M. I don't know of anybody that's, like, blocked from playing rated T games.
I've never paid any attention to the ratings.
Exactly, like, that's the thing, is I get what they're trying to get at for people who want some idea of what's contained within the games, especially if you're, like, a parent buying them for young kids. But I feel like the rating system as a whole is very flawed, because we just mentioned the issue of a lot of those games not necessarily even being all that violent to begin with, and yeah, there's like the issue of sexual themes and like partial nudity or whatever, but 90% of the time, going back to the whole like most similar system I think we have being the movie rating system, most M-rated games I've played, they have just as bad of stuff in PG-13 movies, like, which I find very strange, considering if you're looking at the quote-unquote age ranges they're targeted at, the equivalent to PG-13 is a T-rated game, right? Like,
yeah, it's pretty wild when you consider that the SRB and even the whatever they use to rate movies, I'm not sure what it's called, they're basically not connected at all.
No, and it's really odd too, because like, since a lot of M games can almost be equated to a PG-13 movie, the R-rated movies are like way up, and what's interesting is they keep targeting video games, but I feel like they don't necessarily make those same targets to R-rated movies, or at least it's not as widely covered within the news if they do. And it's not like the same restrictions on going to see like an R-rated movie in theaters aren't in place for the games. Like, I remember growing up, if I wanted an M-rated game, I needed like my mom or somebody to be with me to show her the idea of, yeah, I'm approving this kid getting this game because I'm over 18, or I think it's 17, but still.
Yeah, I think it's just a whole thing. Like, video games came out more recently than movies did, and when there's a lot of violence around, people try to find like the newest thing, like what could be causing the violence now. It's much easier to go and say all video games are banned than to say all films are banned.
Right, exactly, and I guess it is true that films have a much more established cultural center, and I guess the other thing that's really kind of a big issue with this is I just personally feel it's odd to say, oh, we're gonna implement a 10% game tax to counter school violence. School violence is such a vague term. Like, unless you have a specific idea in mind of how you're going to do that, I feel like money isn't necessarily the solution here. Now, money can be an indirect solution to a lot of things, but
yeah, it is very strange. I couldn't really find anything that was stating what exactly this money would be used for, except, like you said, just to counter violence.
Yeah. And it honestly is, like you were bringing up censorship before, it's sort of like a soft censorship format, because now, say I've got two games releasing in the same week, and we can assume they're probably both like major titles being released for $60 a pop. If you throw on this additional 10% sales tax in a state like PA, you end up paying almost $70 for the M-rated game versus $60 for like the T or the E-rated game. And that can be kind of a decent price difference between things. I mean, $10 is $10. I mean, that'll get you a halfway decent PS4 game used at a GameStop.
Yeah, very true.
So it's just odd.
Yeah.
And
just it
yeah,
really
go ahead.
is
Sorry.
like it just does seem more like this is about censorship than about increasing revenue for schools, because there's a lot of other things I can think of that one could tax besides video games that could also, I guess, promote quelling school violence.
Exactly. I mean, you could even implement like higher gun taxes or something, because a lot of the bigger issues with this seem to be revolved around school shootings in particular. I mean, I won't get into that a whole lot, but if you're talking about something with more of a direct correlation, that's one thing that could potentially come to mind. I'm not going to get into my political views on like the amendments involving possession of arms and such, but still.
Yeah, that seems like a more blunt way to tax things, is just doing it like that.
Right. So, I mean, just the whole censorship thing, it's been around for so long, like you said, since the 90s. I don't think this is going to gain any traction, because they already tried it once. and it didn't seem to go through. But we'll have to wait and see. We do live in a weird age politically, so you never know. I mean, there's a bloody rain tax in some states, so...
Oh, the good old days. I remember that.
Yeah, I know, right? But, all right, let's go and move on to our next article. And this one's equally as strange, but more from a business perspective. And that's going to be that Activision is laying off many of its Blizzard employees. Now, Blizzard, are they directly owned by Activision, or are they just like a subsidiary that's somewhat independent? Are you familiar with the relationship there?
Not at all.
Okay, I'm under the impression they basically own them, but they
I usually read this as just Activision Blizzard.
Right, exactly. So I think it's a case similar to like the Disney Star Wars thing, where Disney owns Star Wars, but they sort of let Star Wars do its own independent thing. They just take a cut of the money.
Right.
Type of thing. But what's weird to me about this is Activision's game sales have been going down, right? So they're cutting people off of Blizzard to make it so that a lot of Blizzard's properties have more direct involvement within the Activision studios, as long as I was reading this article correctly. Which is odd because the titles they seem to mention performing poorly aren't the Blizzard titles, they're the Activision titles.
That is something I've noticed in this article.
So it's
things like Destiny 2, Forsaken
King or whatever. Yeah, that has nothing to do with Blizzard. So versus if we look at major Blizzard titles, I mean, just look at the phenomena of mobile gaming that was Hearthstone. That's still a company that pretty much, if you can slap its name on something, it's probably going to do pretty well.
Yeah, and even Call of Duty Black Ops 4 was one of the best-selling games in 2018. So the fact that Activision Blizzard, or Activision, whoever has to do this at all, is pretty interesting.
I think it might have been a case of they just grew a little bit too big for their britches at the time. But just from a strategic standpoint, why touch Blizzard when that's one of your successful entities and not try to learn from Blizzard to figure out how to emulate their success?
Very true.
So it's just weird. But I think this does reflect an overall bigger shift in the gaming market as a whole. Because maybe it's just like having grown some in age, but I feel like Call of Duty games and a lot of the big shooters and AAA titles that were dominant in the market for so long don't seem to be as big of a deal as they used to be. Like, yeah, their sales are still huge, but I remember people used to be so hyper excited for, oh my god, Black Ops 2 is coming out tomorrow, man. I gotta be up, I gotta play it. I'm staying up like 36 hours straight, and I'm gonna go like 4th Prestige within 2 days, and all this other stuff, when I feel like I haven't heard anyone get hyped about that in that kind of a way for a very good many years, and I feel like the hype seems to just simmer out more with each new release.
If you ask me, I just think the genre has been done to death in recent years.
Yeah, it's a really oversaturated market, that's for sure. And I think some of what's being reflected here is the fact that I think people have gotten more and more open to the idea of trying games that aren't necessarily from AAA developers, which has caused, while the overall game sales market has increased, the respective AAA title sales have either stayed relatively similar or maybe even dropped a little bit, because people don't just assume, oh, well, if I want a good game, it's got to come from one of the big names, type of a thing. Maybe that's just me, but I feel like that I'm noticing a growth in the indie department, so...
I mean, that is an interesting viewpoint, and as you mentioned, the indie part of gaming has been exploding recently.
Yeah, and I mean, anytime you've got that, essentially the fact that people are recognizing you don't have to be one of these big names to do really well, it kind of makes it so the big names don't mean so much, which means the big names have to be putting out better games in order for them to sell as well, because you can't just ride off the branding anymore. It's sort of like when a lot of times in movies they'll use like a big named actor, like say Robert Downey Jr., to try and sell a movie that's not that good. Well, if you start to have all these other actors that are doing really well, that are just like smaller names, but they're in good films consistently, and you have their films come out at the same time as a mediocre Robert Downey Jr. film, that other smaller film may perform just as well. So same boat here with indie games to the AAA titles.
Right.
I mean, I think a lot of that kicked off with Minecraft. I think that's a game that can be majorly credited to the explosion of the indie market, because Minecraft to this day is still an extremely popular game. Like, if you talk to anyone, I feel like especially in the demographic of 14 and younger, Minecraft is still one of their go-to games. Like, So it's kind of cool to see this happening in a lot of ways. I don't like the fact that Activision's handling it by hurting Blizzard, which I think is a really cool game developer as a whole, versus Activision. I haven't had the best of experiences with a lot of their games, especially in recent years. But I think what it reflects on the whole about opening the market potentially and showing a broader interest towards a more generalized library of games is a good thing, because it just encourages more creativity amongst developers.
It will be interesting to see where Activision goes with this.
Yeah, it really will be. And I think the fact that they own a company like Blizzard also reflects that there's been a lot more consolidation amongst the AAA companies in more recent years. Such as, I mean, like one of the earlier ones I can think of is when Squaresoft and Enix became one. So,
but we don't know how Activision Blizzard came to be. Did they just buy Blizzard, or did they actually merge?
Right, but the bigger point is just that the companies seem to be getting sucked into one another a little bit more. But I guess that's kind of the nature of the market we live in.
Yeah, that'll happen. I know that's definitely happening with essentially anything Amazon can get its hands on.
Exactly, and they're kind of diving into more and more things. I mean, they're even talking about starting gaming streaming services now. Yeah, that scares me too, but that's a different topic for a different day. Alright, so for our third article today, Xbox has announced they're bringing Xbox Live into a number of different platforms now, and that could include Android, iOS devices, neither of those two are all that surprising, and the Nintendo Switch, of all things? Like, that's kind of the focal point of this. Like, the Android device and the iOS device thing, that makes a lot of sense. You've already got, like, Steam streaming apps on those things that let you stream games from your PC to your phone or whatever, as long as you've got a decent Wi-Fi connection. And you can do a pretty similar thing with, like, PlayStation's remote play service. So that makes sense, right? But another company's online gaming service being available on their competitor's device is just, it's kind of groundbreaking.
Either way, I'm very excited to see this, especially as someone who owns an Xbox One and a Nintendo Switch. I'm really curious to see how Microsoft is going to link those two.
Yeah, me too. I think we're going to have to wait and see exactly what the details are, but my question becomes, is it just going to be sort of like the current Steam app, not like the Steam View app, but just the Steam app that they have for phones where you can kind of message your friend via text, you can check the store, those types of things on the Switch? Or is this going to be full-fledged, like you can do Xbox Live parties on the Switch and do all those types of things?
Well, seeing as Microsoft is one to promote this sort of not exactly sure what the proper name for it is, but essentially the in-house streaming, I think they like to call it.
Right.
Where you can take one device, have it like display and interact with the game, but then actually have the whole game run on another thing. Well, in my mind, that just makes it seem like I could have Forza running on my Xbox One and then just be playing it on the Switch.
Yeah, and I think if we go back a couple console generations, this would have really surprised me a lot more than it currently does. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm still surprised, but part of this almost makes sense because I feel like at this point, the Xbox and Nintendo representatives are each pulling from very different markets of viewers. So I feel like by doing this, you aren't necessarily harming either console. If anything, you're benefiting them. Because at that point, if you've got both consoles, you're kind of benefiting from both. And this kind of writes off further cooperation between those two companies. Because I feel like combined, they actually can keep up with the juggernaut that is Sony. I mean, let's face it, right now, in today's age, you could be standing in a room of 10 people, say the word PlayStation 5, and when only 5 of the people in the room are actually gamers, 7 of them turn their heads. Like, so and a lot of the reason is because PlayStation's managed to find a really nice balance between their powerful online play system and a lot of great IPs and first-party titles and titles that are exclusive to the PlayStation 4. Well, if you've got companies like Nintendo and Xbox doing that, you're talking about the first-party developer working with the online service provider when it comes to gaming. So they actually then are able to propose a strong competitor to the PlayStation 4. So I think this alliance of sorts, if that is indeed what's going on, makes a lot of sense.
So you're optimistic about an actual alliance between Microsoft and Nintendo?
I don't know if I'd say an outright alliance, but I think we are continuing to see increased cooperation between the two companies. And I mean, that can be shown through the fact that they are encouraging cross-platform play, whereas Sony seems to be fighting it with every tooth and nail. They're exploiting the fact that, hey, we're the most successful console this generation. You want to play with your friends on PlayStation, you're not doing that on your Xbox. You got to go get yourself a PlayStation type of thing. Versus the Switch and the Xbox, if the game comes out for both, they're like, hey, you want to play with your friend on a Switch? Cool. All you got to do is go through the game and go through their servers and you're square. And, like, adding on to that, obviously Nintendo has to be okay with this for Xbox Live to be being added to the Switch. So I think that already shows that the companies are at least willing to hear each other out. I don't know if an outright alliance is in play here, but I'm saying in theory it could make sense.
It certainly would, and it would certainly be awesome.
Yeah, I mean, the thing to think about here, and the direction I could almost see this going, is Microsoft's working on their new console, right? And I think it's a little bit late in the development for it to be with the first wave of the console, but I feel like with the second wave of their console, because we are in the age of you remake the same console at least 3 times to make sure you get it right, that perhaps they integrate the aspects of the Switch being able to cooperate with it a lot more if this pattern continues. Because, once more, going back to the whole idea here, Switch's biggest flaw right now is its online service is lacking in a lot of areas. Like, you have to go through a lot of hoops to be able to get a good voice chat service to your friends in a lot of games, right? Well, Xbox Live to this day is probably the highest quality voice chatting service I've probably ever used. Back in the 360 days, man, that was the way to talk to friends, was through Xbox Live, because it was high quality, it didn't cut out, it gave really good performance speed most of the time, you had a lot of options, and it was revolutionary for its day, and the ones more or less kept up with that quality of standard. So if you provide that on a Switch, then suddenly that thing's able to do everything, and you've got access to the powerhouse that is usually Microsoft's consoles. I mean, despite the fact that I'm not usually pro Xbox, I do have to acknowledge the One X is the most powerful home console of the generation by a decent margin.
Whoop whoop.
So, yeah, exactly. Like, I can kind of see this working out, and that actually kind of segues well into what our daily topic is, which is the idea of companies collaborating with consoles. I feel like Microsoft and Nintendo working together isn't overly far-fetched. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you do have to consider that Microsoft and Nintendo do come from very different backgrounds. Microsoft, since the early days of its existence, has mainly been prioritized with computer software and operating systems. They only got into video games, well, now it's like 20 years ago.
2001, I believe.
Yeah, but it's just hitting me that, like, oh my god.
Yeah, oh my god, that
ago.
was almost 20 years ago, man. Like,
and I'm just like, wow, it was so recent. But I mean, I guess when you compare it to Nintendo, who's been in this for even before video game consoles were a thing.
Yeah, man, they're the granddaddy.
It is interesting to see those two, of all people, getting into a sort of an alliance with one another. You would think it would be more along the lines of Nintendo and Sony, because if you recall, they did try to make that CD add-on for the SNES way back.
Oh yeah, we're going to be getting into that one.
But yeah, I just think it's interesting because each company has such a different background, and yet here they are, they're cooperating with each other, with the cross-platform, and now this, an Xbox Live portal on the Switch. I mean, that's just...
Right. And once more, it's kind of the idea of why not? Because I think a lot of people, and I don't know if people in Nintendo have directly recognized this, the whole idea of the SNES CD add-on, let's actually touch on that real quick, because I think that'll further our points here. So essentially what we're talking about here, for those of you that don't know, is back in the 90s, I think was it 94 that the Philips CDI got released? Or 93? It's one of those 2 years, I believe.
To do more research, but yeah, it was around that time.
Somewhere in that time zone, Nintendo was essentially looking to make a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo, and initially they went to Sony, and they actually got really far with this. They got to the point where they had functional models. They had about 300 of them in a small production run. But a lot of licensing issues came into play with Sony. Nintendo didn't like the contracts that allowed Sony to use their properties to make games for this additional add-on, and the way the profit margins worked out between the two companies there wasn't something they were very fond of. So Nintendo goes to their rival, which is Philips, and you end up with them working on this add-on for the Super Nintendo, which actually never came to be. Instead, it spawned off this own system called the Philips CDI, which is supposed to be a home entertainment system. Could play CDs. It was the first console that was able to do like full motion video in the games, and it had some weird first-party Nintendo characters on some of its games, including a game called Hotel Mario and 3 Legend of Zelda games. I believe you played all of those, so I'm going to pass the baton to you on this one.
Yeah, it's ironic to me because Nintendo got upset that Sony would have control over the first party games, right? So then they go to Philips and do the add-on. Guess who has control over the first party characters? Guess who's allowed to make games with Mario and Zelda? Philips.
Yeah.
It's crazy. So
and what's sad, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but those are the Zelda games with the really horrible like animations and such, right?
those are the ones that are mocked on YouTube, yes.
Brilliant, that's what I'm thinking of here. But yeah, eventually that console went on to flop, but what eventually ended up creating Nintendo's worst enemy was the fact that they started off collaborating with Sony, because that's what managed to convince the Sony execs that, well, hey, we were going to kind of halfway dive into this console thing. We've already got this under development. Why don't we go ahead and finish it and make our own console? And also just to say, screw you, Nintendo, for cutting us out. And then they came out with the PlayStation 1, and ever since then, Sony's been a pretty dominant force in the console market. And so where I was going with all that sort of roundabout way of doing things is that what we're essentially looking at is, I think, Nintendo facing down its demon more than ever that it created. I mean, they created their own worst enemy with that whole Sony deal there. Is that I think maybe they're starting to acknowledge that was a mistake in the past. Maybe we have an opportunity here with Microsoft. I mean, there have been some recent interviews from Nintendo implying that they've said at some point they may drop out of the hardware market. It hasn't been like directly stated, but there have been enough hints that a lot of fans have sort of chained it together that perhaps that's where they're going with things. And I feel like because of their pride, they would definitely work with Microsoft over Sony. So
you think this has more to do with sort of like Sony miffed us because we miffed them, so now we're just going to keep on miffing them?
Yeah, I honestly feel like that's what it is in some ways. I mean, I feel like this rivalry, I don't know whether this is intentional, but I feel like there's enough to it that it's sort of been subtly hinted at for a long time now. I mean, for instance, look at bloody PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale or whatever it's called. It's literally a Super Smash Brothers clone, right? And then,
very true.
Like, even looking at a game like Super Smash Brothers, what is one of the main notable companies that won't include its characters within the game? Anything that's owned by Sony, right? Versus there have been myths all over the place of them potentially adding Steve from Minecraft to it, which is owned by Microsoft.
Huh.
So it's just sort of like this idea that I think there's been this invisible boundary between them. So I guess where I was going with today's topic is the idea of multiple companies sort of collaborating on a console. Because what we've viewed since the beginning of the console industry is this idea of these single companies making a console with dedicated hardware and dedicated systems of software used for said console. So in the past, we've gotten this from time to time. We had something like the Philips CDI, which is supposed to be a collaboration, sort of turned into Philips' own thing. Then we even had like the Panasonic system that included the ability to play like Sega, not the Master System, the Genesis games on it.
Genesis.
Yeah, as well as I believe.
And I believe you're mentioning the Pioneer Laser Active.
Yes, exactly. And we haven't seen like something like that for quite some time. But I think this time is almost ripe for it, because if you look for the era where that type of crap was happening a lot, it was when games were transitioning from cartridges to CDs, right? Well, we're sort of in a similar transition time now from discs back to dedicated SD cards, quote-unquote cartridges, like what are on the Switch, and B, to digital versus physical.
Yeah, and that really does also make you question, because, as you've mentioned before, a lot of companies are starting sort of this stream mentality when it comes to video games. Microsoft already has the Game Pass, and Amazon, you said, was going to be jumping in with their own thing about video game streaming.
There's even talks of Verizon doing it. Like, it's crazy.
Ew.
I know, right?
But it does make you think, because a lot of people at least already seem to be comfortable with the idea that you can buy a game digitally and not even fully own it.
Right, because essentially you're licensing it if you're buying it digitally, and technically that's what you're doing with the physical copy too, but the thing with the physical copy is if they decide to cut off your ability to download that game, you always have the bloody disc. Like, unless you break the disc yourself, you always have that to be able to use.
Exactly.
So I think with this type of a market landscape pictures is the idea for some of these crazy collaborations to start again, because we are in that transitional era. And we talked about the Microsoft Nintendo thing already, but there's no reason that with a lot of these third-party companies trying to get into streaming services, they're going to have to collaborate with some of these things. So I think it's even possible we see the division of the market even further, or potential unity. I think it could go either direction here. I mean, let's say Amazon gets into the streaming, right? So they could end up streaming for all platforms, or perhaps they strike some kind of a special deal with some of the companies, and then these companies start licensing out their streaming services to third-party companies, and all kinds of weird stuff can start to unfold from here. Or we could see collaborations like the Nintendo box. Like, that's the name that's been ringing in my head all week.
Beautiful name.
I know, right? That would be so cool. But those are the types of things that are kind of ringing around right now because we are in a transitional era for consoles. And I think the Switch even landmarks that too. It raises the question of, do we really still need something that's dedicated to being at home, or can everything just be on the go?
Yeah. It's definitely looking the direction of the Switch, because there's really no compromise on it, aside from some minor graphical hindrances, but even then, they're barely noticeable.
Exactly, particularly on the smaller screen. So, with the whole idea of these weird console collaborations, I mean, you obviously have the big three, but you were mentioning before how you missed and I think it was one of the previous podcasts, you missed some of the eras when we had these multi-generational consoles, like when we had like 7 companies with their hands in the pot. I think now is either when we're going to see it shrink again, back to sort of like a SNES Genesis era thing where there are other companies in the mix, but there's a clear defined big two, or where it's going to kind of blow up because now you're going to have the opportunity to do a lot of new things with these streaming things. Making consoles gets a lot cheaper if you don't have to include a disk drive or like a card reader slot. So things are just getting very odd here. I mean, some other interesting... Do you have any other ideas of like some odd collaborations we could see?
That we could see? Well, we already know Microsoft and Nintendo could possibly collaborate, but who do we have that Sony could reach into and try and make something out of that?
That's a good question. I think part of the problem is Sony right now is facing an odd predicament. Or not an odd predicament, but they're in kind of a very weird space in that out of the big three, essentially, that we've had for these past several generations, Sony's been the most stable sales-wise. The PlayStation 1 destroyed the generation it was out. The PlayStation 2 is the greatest selling console of all time. The PlayStation 3, they fell a little bit short on in terms of sales compared to the other ones, but now PlayStation 4 is on track to keep up with the PlayStation 2, which is just insane. So they're the most stable, and I think they're the least in the need for something like this. Back when we were looking at like the equivalent, the era I compared it to before, with the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, they kind of reached out to these disc companies because the technology was changing quick. Their sales were strong, but especially in the case of Nintendo, they were facing a market in America where they were starting to lose out to the Genesis. So it created the need for something like that. So I don't know that Sony necessarily needs it. That being said, though, I did read some articles it's probably about a month or so back, that Apple was looking into purchasing Sony, and that collaboration almost makes sense to me in some ways. Like, of all collaborations, that makes sense, because Sony's, while they've dealt with a lot of phones and stuff, they've never directly been a computer company, so it wouldn't necessarily be them being consumed by a competitor. Apple's been sort of like a soft competitor to them. And Apple, being the juggernaut that they are, getting into the game market makes sense. I mean, that's something... Let's face it, most electronics developers try to do gaming at some point, or have, right? So that would sort of make sense for them to make that purchase, and Sony's struggling enough right now in their other fields that aren't gaming related, like their movie field, that them getting bought out sort of almost could be a realistic possibility there. At which rate, the Apple PlayStation, like... just saying that could be a really weird company, and then it would turn into a much broader scope of this whole console war, because then it goes into Microsoft and Apple are two of the big titans that are always competing on everything. Phones, computers, just internet, being able to stream things, right? So then you've got the fact that could turn into a console war too, because you've got the Apple PlayStation versus the versus the Microsoft Xbox. And then I think the big thing here is if one of these companies starts to collaborate, it may create an environment where others need to as well.
The darkest timeline.
Right, in order for things to keep up. But I don't know if I would consider that the darkest timeline. Part of me almost wants to see it play out. See, like, when Sega dropped out of the console market, for a while they were, like, not owned, but they were clearly, like, trying to help Nintendo. At least from what I saw, I felt like they were working more with Nintendo than any other company.
Well, immediately after they dropped out of the console market, or at least the hardware market with Dreamcast, they actually went to Microsoft.
Right.
First and foremost.
Right, but then, like, towards the DS era, we saw a lot of Sega games going to the Wii and the DS and everything.
They eventually made their way to Nintendo.
Right, and that was, like, one collaboration that was always like, you know what? That would have been really cool to see those two, like, the two old farts work together. That would have been great. But it's something that we never got to experience, versus, like, now, this is the pristine environment to see something really crazy like that happen.
I mean, the thing that worries me is that you mentioned sort of, Apple and Microsoft somehow rising up to each other and battling it out. That again limits the playing field.
It does.
As I've said before, remember the generations I've mentioned previously where there were 7 different companies with their hands in the pots. That is always one of the most fascinating and just really awesome generations, if you ask me, because there's so much variety, there's so much happening, there's so many games coming out. I'm worried that if the playing field is limited, what's that going to mean for gaming?
Yeah, you make a good point there, but even considering that, I think it does create an issue. Like you said, it does kind of limit the competition, which inherently limits creativity sometimes because they don't have to be as creative. And it also means there aren't as many ways to experience it. So let's go the other direction for a second here. Rather than everything merging, I think this is an equally opportune time for a lot of companies to sort of emerge and give their whirl at things again. There have been a lot of people rooting for Sega to get back into the console market, which I don't think is going to happen. Sega, especially in recent years, has sort of just funneled more and more into not even making new games so much as just like remasters of old things, or being like a porting company that brings games over from Japan to America. Like they do that a lot with Atlas games. So I don't necessarily think they're a prime candidate. But if we look at things like, for example, emulation devices, they're on the rise, right? We even see first-party companies putting out their own specialized emulation devices. That market's not going to...
You mean like the NES Classic?
Right. And that market's not going to die. So I could see a dedicated market to Android devices, in quotes, rising, where the idea of them being made for emulation, now they can't outright market it as that very easily without getting into some legal gray area. But
so like more Ouya's.
Right, except done right. So I would say more along like the lines of the NVIDIA Shield. But those types of things, I think, are starting to carve out a realm in the market. I mean, that's why SNES Classics weren't even able to be gotten on shelves for so long. Why? Because it's a piece of cake to hack, and then you have access to the entire Super Nintendo library running like butter, playing on like hardware that feels very close to the original for the most part. So that market, I think, is on the rise. That's like one thing. Then you've got our standard big three. They could still exist, right? Then you've got this option for streaming services. I think that blows the market up. If we go, and it opens up opportunities for companies like Apple and Amazon that are just massive to try their hands at these types of things. If Amazon creates their own streaming service with the amount of money that they have, I don't think it's outside the realm of the possibility for them to even maybe give the console market a whirl.
But then we're approaching the whole thing of are consoles themselves necessary anymore? I mean, if we have things that can stream, a lot of companies are looking into, I remember a while back, I think it was Assassin's Creed Odyssey was released on Switch, but only in Japan, because how it ran was it would essentially be streaming it from like another place. It
Right.
didn't actually run on the Switch.
And that
We
go
we'd
ahead, sorry.
probably be seeing something more along the lines of that if streaming was to get involved, because of course Amazon already has a powerhouse in terms of just like the computing power that they use on a daily basis. It wouldn't surprise me if that was their main sell. It's just, hey, if you get Amazon streaming service, you don't even have to run the game. You can just stream it.
Right, and at that point, if they were to enter, I'll use the word quotation marks around this console market, then they could create just a device that's literally just optimized for streaming something, because then, as you're describing, you can have this building with this massive processor to run all these games for you, and it basically just uses your device as a screen and a controller. You don't need to have any kind of processors in there or anything else, and then you can sell that for a stupidly cheap price compared to everything else because you don't have all that extra hardware in there, and then suddenly they're creating a whole new market in and of itself.
Very true, exactly.
And then that kind of raises all kinds of other questions. So once more, we're getting into an odd place with the way gaming's going because it's hard to develop. And this kind of builds off of last week's podcast with the hardware versus software thing. But streaming just kind of opens it up. So it's kind of like there are infinite possibilities. And I think that just is going to continue to expand, given how people seem to pull in both directions. People want the streaming, but the more you have people pulling towards streaming, the more you have people like us that fight back and are like, no, give me my bloody hardware. And then you have people pulling in sort of an omnidirectional thing of, yeah, I like streaming. I also like downloading my games to emulate from the old systems, but I don't want to buy the old systems. And it's just kind of tugging in all these different directions. So I think we're in a very prime market just for everything to explode, if people can just find a good way to make something good at a reasonable price to do it.
Yeah, sort of reminds me of the PlayStation TV. We're probably just going to be seeing a bunch of those coming out.
Yeah, we honestly could. And I think the PlayStation TV, much like the Vita and much like the Dreamcast in a lot of ways, is sort of like a segue system in that it in and of itself will fail, but I think the ideas from it may be learned from for other things.
Perhaps. Sort of like what was it? Never mind.
So I'd say it's sort of like a demo system for everybody else to pick up on. So while we're on this subject, before we move on, how would you feel if Nintendo dropped out of the hardware business?
Completely crushed. I don't think that they would, because this has been brought up a lot, especially back in the Wii U days.
Right, because that was flopping so hard.
Yeah, people were throwing that around left and right. There were all kinds of rumors. But at the end of the day, Nintendo did come out and say, no, we're not going to stop making hardware because it's one of the things that makes us unique. And I do think that part of Nintendo's whole brand, part of their whole essence, to get poetic, does reside in the fact that they do consistently make all of their own consoles, and they are usually the most unique ones on the market.
Yeah.
And that something would be just inherently lost if they just say, hey, now you can play Zelda on your phone.
I completely agree. And that's the area where I think Nintendo's actually kind of built themselves up to become the least outdated of the companies. Primarily because their experience with their consoles is always unique, as you identified. I mean, even if we're talking about the Wii U, that was the first thing where it's like, hey, I want to watch this movie, but I also want to keep playing my console game. Oh, wait, I can. I've got a second screen to do that on. Or if we're looking at the DS, you have two screens. That creates a really weird experience. Or not weird, but like kind of neat. I mean, for example, I was talking about Etrian Odyssey when we were talking about releases. In that game, one of the main mechanics is the fact that you can draw your map on the bottom screen and always have access to it while you're playing the main game on your top screen. That's a really unique experience. You're not going to be able to emulate very well on like a phone or something like that. Or the Switch. You've got access to motion controls and gyroscopes and all kinds of other things. You've got a powerhouse of a system that can be displayed on your TV, done co-op with friends, and taken with you wherever.
Exactly. I mean, imagine if Nintendo did drop out during the Wii U era. We would never see anything like this, probably. I don't think any other company out there has the gumption to go and say, hey, we're going to bring, like, I guess it is like Wii U quality games. We're going to make them actually portable. and
Right.
we're going to be the ones doing it. You're not going to have to go get like an NVIDIA Shield. It's going to be us.
Right, and even adding to that, I mean, if we're looking at the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One in their very nature, they're essentially just a PC with a different face slapped on it that's optimized to run on a TV.
Yeah, I've never found them to be that different of consoles, especially hardware-wise.
They really aren't, and I feel like over time they've just gotten more and more similar. So, like, in terms of that whole Nintendo thing, and while we were on the topic of it, that going back to essentially where we started here, that's why I feel like the Xbox Nintendo collaboration almost makes sense. Because Xbox would bring you all the power you need, but Nintendo would bring the creativity to be able to stay relevant.
I could see that working out very well.
Because Sony, I feel like, has always done a great job stealing Nintendo's ideas and then just rebranding them. Like, honestly, where I brought up PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, right? And then we look at things like the PlayStation Move, right? I mean, the Kinect was done as well, but the PlayStation Move was essentially just a rip-off of the Wii. You still have the controllers and everything in action, those types of things. The PlayStation, that wouldn't even exist if they wouldn't have collaborated with Nintendo in the first place. Even if we look at a couple of their intellectual properties, or actually, that's not a case I can make as well, so I won't go that route. But my point is, I feel like they learn a lot from Nintendo. I don't want to say they take it, because they do put their own spin on it, but I feel like they've always been a little bit more innovative than Microsoft, so they would stand on their own a little bit better, because I feel like Microsoft, once more, it shows that their roots are in computers.
How so? I'm just curious.
Just because I think that their consoles have always been essentially computers optimized for playing on a TV.
Well, that's what a game console is.
I mean, you're not wrong, but I just feel like the individuality of it and the feeling of playing on it as opposed to a PC has never been as distinct.
Yeah.
I feel like with the PlayStation 4, it's gotten a lot closer to being exactly like that. But like, and I don't think PlayStation's done a great job distinguishing themselves from it either, but still, that's just a personal taste thing.
I guess so. I mean, you are right about PlayStation not distinguishing itself hardware-wise.
Not anymore. But yeah, I think that about covers it for this topic. I mean, in terms of just, we're in an era where a lot can happen, and we're just gonna have to wait and see. I think, and you could say that about any era for games, right? I just think this one in particular stands out because of the transitional time that we're in. So moving right along here onto our next segment after a long-winded conversation there. Let's go ahead and talk about some potential games coming out next week. We've got big things like Crackdown 3 and Metro Exodus being launched. That brings us back into the controversy of Epic Games versus Steam, which is going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I mean, any big releases for you next week?
For me, no.
I mean, I'm in the same boat. I just know that there's a lot of AAA titles if you're into those types of things. I believe Anthem launches next week as well, which to me, I hate to say it. I haven't played it, so I shouldn't really say this, but it sort of strikes me as just being Destiny 2.0, and I wasn't super impressed with Destiny to begin with.
That's what a lot of people are saying.
And I mean, if you're into that type of thing, it's great and all, but if I'm going to play an MMO, I sort of prefer the classic feel of an MMO, like some of the World of Warcraft inspired types of things, so... But yeah, those are some big game releases we got coming out next week. So let's go ahead and talk about what we're playing. You're up first, my friend.
Oh no! Okay, so I've been playing more of the Twilight Princess remaster on Wii U.
Sweet.
Yeah, I'm really digging it. Really digging the soundtrack. The gameplay is pretty good. The story's kind of at a sore spot, but I'm getting through it.
Are the graphics still holding up really well? I know you had mentioned before the Wii U graphics were looking really good on this.
It's like I said before, there are some points where you can tell like they just brought this over from the GameCube, but then there are other points where you have to remind yourself that this did come out in like 2006.
Right, and I found with a lot of those HD remasters, usually the cutscenes show dramatically more improvement than the gameplay itself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I know especially with the Kingdom Hearts remaster, like, when I first watched the opening cutscene to that, I was like, wow, this looks better than some legit PlayStation 4 games I've played, and this was made for the PS2. Then I got into the gameplay, I was like, oh, this looks like a really nice PS2 game. Like, that was kind of the comparison I could make there. But I'm glad to hear you're digging Twilight Princess. I always thought the aesthetic of that game was really great.
I agree.
And it was always funny because that game was kind of a direct counter argument from Nintendo to a lot of the fans that hated Wind Waker because of how cartoony and childish it looked in some people's opinions. So They were like, all right, we'll throw you in the exact opposite direction with the edgiest Zelda game we've ever made.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I love it.
We're gonna have freaking werewolves, man. Werewolves. It's kind of cool.
You are the werewolf.
Dude, imagine in Smash if they would have made a bloody, like, transformation of Link into a wolf. That would have been great.
Man, that should have been his final Smash.
It would have been really nice. Yeah, I mean, they at least could have done that for Brawl when that game was kind of the most relevant Zelda of the era.
Very true.
But yeah, anything else that you've been playing?
You want to hear about more Smash and Skyrim?
Oh yeah. Same dizzle
right.
with those, I'm guessing.
What? Sorry.
Same deal with those.
Oh yeah.
That's they're great games. They're easy to put a lot of time into, and it's good, man. My game lineup hasn't changed a whole lot either. I'm still trucking my way through Persona 4. Still got freaking Spider-Man I'm trying to play through. But I did add on top of that this week, I've been working on Uncharted Golden Abyss. Really neat game. It's my first Uncharted game, so some people are probably going to be like, oh, that's not the real experience. You're playing that on a Vita? That's not even a real console, man. But, like, it's pretty awesome. Like, have you ever played Uncharted before?
One time, I mistakenly bought the European version of an Uncharted game on... No, wait for it. I bought the European version of, I believe it was Uncharted 2. It was like a special edition. It looked, I just thought it was a really flashy case, but it turns out that's just how they looked over in Europe.
Right.
I bought that game on PS3, put it in my PS3, and it starts installing the North American release, and I'm able to play it.
Dude,
how's that for region locking?
That's because PlayStation has never region locked, and that's one of the things I love about them.
Yeah, it was only after I looked at it wait, that's not the ESRB rating this. What?
Dude, back in the PSP era, there are a lot of games for PSP that are a heck of a lot cheaper if you get the European version. So that's what I've been doing as I've expanded my PSP library a little bit.
Oh, nice.
When I was on the peak of my Yu-Gi-Oh hype train, I was getting the Tag Force games. And the American versions of the first and second games of that series retail for $50 to $60 a pop now, versus the European ones you can get for $30 to $35, or at least you could at the time when I was buying them. So that was really cool. And I was like, hey, this isn't region locked. That's the one thing I hate about you, Nintendo. You region lock everything. Why?
We might have touched on this before. Is the Switch region locked? I can't remember. I don't think it is.
I hope not. I hope not. Please tell me they've learned their lesson. I mean, come on, man. Some of these games have gotten stupidly expensive, and especially back in the day, you used to make a lot of really cool Japanese games that never made it over here.
Oh, yeah. Nintendo was the king of that.
And if you ask me, I understand a lot of games come out in Japan first, but while we're on the topic of region locking, I almost feel like it would make more sense for them just to produce one cartridge and just have you choose the language.
I mean, but then at that point, say the game had to have a lot cut for the American release.
Right.
I mean, then you'd be putting in all that stuff on the cartridge that was cut for no reason. It would just be taking up space. And with Nintendo Switch cartridges basically being sold by the amount of space they have, that wouldn't be such a very smart move business-wise.
That's fair. I guess I was just considering the fact that that doesn't happen usually too much anymore, where they cut out a lot of content. And with that being the case, I feel like it would, in some cases, be cheaper for the company just to have the language option. And then instead of saying, oh, we'll produce 50,000 Japanese cartridges and 100,000 English cartridges, oh, we'll just produce 150,000 cartridges.
I mean, I guess.
It would probably be very situational at which rate that just complicates things for the company and the people who run their productions. So.
True.
But yeah, on the topic of Uncharted, because we totally derailed there, it's a really cool experience. I don't know if you really got into Uncharted 2, but it's sort of like if you were playing Indiana Jones as a video game.
Nice.
Which is neat. I mean, you go on these treasure hunts with things. There aren't as many mythical elements involved with things, but you do deal with a lot of like crime lords and such, at least in Golden Abyss. There's a decent challenge there. I wouldn't say it's too bad. I am playing it on max difficulty, but it hasn't been too rough so far. There've been a couple times where it's like, wait a second, I'm supposed to shoot down 8 guys while I'm climbing a ladder with a pistol. What is this? But for the most part, it's been very well balanced. There's a lot of cool parts where you're just kind of doing some parkour as Nathan Drake. There's some nice storytelling. The soundtrack's pretty cool. It sounds like an adventure movie soundtrack, and I think this is one of the games that really served as, not Golden Abyss specifically, but from my understanding, the Uncharted series was what sort of launched Sony into the idea of being the developer when it came to cinematic gaming, which has kind of been their trademark lately.
Yeah, I do remember. I'm like the one person who wasn't a huge fan of The Last of Us.
I've never played it, so...
Just because a lot of times it did just feel like a movie. And then every once in a while the game would be like, hey, protag, can you go grab that ladder? And then like that was your gameplay. Then you'd grab the ladder and then it would be like you're all climbing up the ladder and talking like a movie.
Yeah, and I think there is definitely a clear line that needs to be drawn there, because if you're talking about that type of gameplay, that almost leans more into like the visual novel category, and there's nothing wrong with those, but they're sort of their own thing. Like, I wouldn't necessarily... Exactly. I mean, they're games, but they're sort of a very separate offshoot category of games. It's sort of like... I'm just trying to use a music equivalent, and then I blanked on it right as I went to say it. But it's still, they're sort of games, but they sort of aren't, and I think there's a large market for it. But I definitely don't think it's for everybody, because it's not nearly as interactive a lot of times. Now, I do think they've made a lot of progress with it. Like, I would describe Spider-Man, for instance, as being a very cinematic game, particularly if you don't stop and do all kinds of side missions the way I do. In that there are a lot of great cutscenes, a lot of them have, like, quick time events where you need to press buttons and such, but there's also a lot of meaty gameplay with combat and such thrown in there, and I think Sony's done usually a pretty good job of mixing that up. But they've definitely made some slip-ups here and there. Like, The Last of Us sort of sounds almost like a Heavy Rain-esque games from what I've heard of that, where it's a lot of cutscenes with like some quick time stuff, but the gameplay itself is sometimes a little minimized.
This just in, Nintendo Switch game cards are not region locked.
Yes! That means I can play my games I can't understand and take them with me.
That's true. Have you heard of the thing where you can actually create like another account on your Switch, set the language to Japanese, and then have access to the Japanese eShop?
Yeah, man. You were actually able to do a pretty similar setup type of thing on the Vita, which is awesome, just because they aren't region locking things.
It's so good we've finally gotten past that hump.
Well, especially with the fact that on the Switch Online service, now they're opening up new NES games to it, and some of them are starting to be exclusive to Japan, which, once more, doesn't make a lot of sense to me in this day and age. But still, like, the exclusivity thing, I feel like the further we've went in time and the more the market in America, I feel, has diversified, the more I feel like the exclusive to Japan thing rarely makes sense. Like, back in the day, okay, you're not going to port every Final Fantasy over here. That sort of makes sense. You're still trying to figure out if there's a bloody market for it. But nowadays, you could drop the most obscure of JRPGs, and most of the time, as long as they're well made, they'll still sell pretty well.
Very true. We have seen a lot of, like, especially nowadays, like when I just talk to people, a lot more people are interested in those sort of niche games and genres.
Yeah, like, even if we just go back 10 years ago, if you went up and talked to like 10 people who own, say, like an Xbox or a PlayStation, they were probably all playing pretty much the same games. Versus if I do that now, I'm going to hear everything from like, oh, I'm playing the Resident Evil 2 remake, to like, yeah, I'm playing through Persona 5 for the first time, to like, yeah, dude, I just got the latest COD and I prestige for like the 18th gajillionth time. I am the OG best gamer. To like, yeah, man, Fortnite's where it's at. To Pokemon, my brother, Pokemon. Like, it's, or then you can throw in all kinds of indie titles too. Throw in like Minecraft, throw in, I'm blanking, that one game that Grant really likes that he was talking
Celeste?
about. No, but that's a good title. That serves the same purpose. He was talking about like some sort of Metroidvania-esque game. Games are just sort of all over the place.
Metroidvania sounds like something I really want to play now.
Well, it's not a game. It's just sort of like in that same vein.
I just wish that there was a Metroidvania now.
Dude, when we get that Sony Nintendo collab, that will never happen. Maybe they'll rope Konami in with it, and then they'll do Metroidvania, because Castlevania has been leaning a lot more towards Sony in recent years.
Yeah, I just got done watching the Castlevania anime on Netflix.
Was that actually good?
I mean, it was good. It's worth watching if you like Castlevania.
I have yet to finish one of the games. I started the original on Super Nintendo a while back. It was pretty good. But I had just finished, or went most of the way through Metroid Zero Mission, so I kind of wanted a break from that style of game.
Yeah, I just got Castlevania Bloodlines on Genesis.
Oh, nice.
I'm very current with the times, as you can tell.
Freaking crap, dude. But okay, while we're talking about this, let's hit on Sega for a second here. What is with the fact that they're like back in the console market with their old consoles? Like,
do you mean like those little things you see at Target that can actually like play a Genesis game?
Well, no. They're releasing like remastered hardware for the Genesis and stuff that can run actual Genesis cartridges. And I'm like, oh, so the modern console generation consists of the Nintendo Switch, the PlayStation 4, the Xbone, and the Sega Genesis. Like,
so are you talking about the little like at games things that like
there's an at games one, but there's another company that I can't remember the name of that's producing like a higher quality one.
Oh man.
Too, and then I've heard rumors of them working on some new like Saturn hardware.
Yes.
So it's like
so hype.
It's like Sega, you're getting back into the market with the same stuff you put out like 30 years ago or 20, 30 years ago. And the weird part is it's actually selling like pretty well.
Can't wait for my Nintendo GameCube to compete with the PS5.
Yeah, dude. Nintendo. Oh yeah, we're dropping out of the new hardware business. Guess what we're dropping? The GameCube HD remaster. Like, we'll stop remastering games. We'll start remastering systems.
Good.
It's freaking great, dude. And the funny thing is, like, I was talking about emulators being on the rise before, but we also see the rise of companies acknowledging that people do want to play the actual hardware, and that's why we see things like the Retron 5 doing pretty well, where it's like, hey, this is like 16 old consoles in one. You just pop in the cartridge, it's got HDMI out, and you're good.
Do you remember when Atari announced that they would be getting back into the games market?
Yes, I do. And we're still waiting on that to happen, right?
Yeah, the Kickstarter, let me see. I think they're still, they're still preparing to ship, basically. But there was this whole big controversy and everything. It was...
So they have the console developed?
Now, the thing that got...
preparing to ship, that implies to me you have the console developed.
The thing with me, like, yes, they have the console developed, but the thing with me is that they're very, very vague on what this console is supposed to be. Is it supposed to be like an Ouya, or is it supposed to compete with the Xbone and PS4? We don't know. And that's one of the reasons I didn't put money down for it, because like I literally didn't know what I was buying. Like, is this just a way for me to play all my 2600 games in HDMI, or is this actually like going to be a new platform?
Yeah, that's really odd. I'm curious to see what they're doing with that. Personally, I think Atari getting back into the market, they're choosing an odd time to do it, unless they're doing like something small scale like what Sega's been doing. Just because while it is an open time, I feel like they're an odd company to take advantage of the open time. Because their last console for home was the Jaguar, right?
Jaguar CD was the last platform. Jaguar was the last dedicated console, yeah.
And it's been years, and they haven't really done anything other than software development. And I feel like...
even then, barely.
Yeah, it's been minimal at best.
Roller Coaster Tycoon.
Yeah, unlike Sega, which, while their software development has been shrinking in recent years, they've still been doing a lot of ports, and their characters have still been a big deal. Atari kind of lacks that IP power. They were in their like last years of console things, it always felt like they were a little bit behind, other than being the first 64-bit system, technology-wise, in terms of being very consumer-friendly, which I think that's kind of the key to consoles now, and the main reason people still choose a console over a PC is the user-friendliness. And on top of that, you throw in the fact that streaming's starting to become a thing, and I just feel like they're in an awkward place, man.
But Android has wood grain.
Oh wait, never mind. I'm in. Like,
there you go.
Like, take my $1,000 right now. Give me a wood. Give me. No, I don't even want a console. I want a piece of wood I can try and slam a cartridge into. And then I'm gonna
Andrew,
drill
that's what an
holes.
Atari is.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Let's go, man. Next time on the channel, Logan and I are gonna do a Let's Play of Pong.
Dude, I have a Pong machine. Let's do it.
Dude, I've got a AV to HDMI upscaler. I will bring over my Elgato, and we're going to do a Pong Let's Play, and it's gonna be the greatest thing in the world.
I'm so down.
Okay, this is an actual thing. Coming to you
Good.
sometime in the next 3 weeks. Pong Let's Play. It's gonna be great. It's gonna be like 6 hours long, and it's just gonna be Pong.
No pause button.
No pause button. It'll be amazing.
It will be.
And it's gonna be a good time. So I think that about wraps it up for the podcast, unless you had any closing thoughts.
Can't wait for Pong.
All right. Yeah, me too, man. Me too. So also, quick side note before we close this out, this podcast can now be found on iTunes and Spotify as well as Podbean. Links to iTunes and Spotify will be included down below. And as for everything else, you can always catch what's going on with Newbark Gaming on the YouTube channel, including that upcoming Pong Let's Play and the good old Etrian Odyssey first impression video, which will be coming out later this week. And as for everything else, hope you guys enjoyed the video. If so, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, etc. down below. If not, constructive criticism is always welcome. And I'll catch you guys next time with the Newbark News Podcast.
Catch you later, y'all.